All right, so thank you all again for joining us tonight to talk about the secret lives of wild bees. Nick Dorian is an ecologist, an educator, and a naturalist. He actually just received his PhD from Tufts University, where he studied the population ecology of solitary bees, and he ran the Tufts Pollinator Initiative, an urban pollinator conservation and community outreach group. He also co-wrote and photographed an online field guide to wild bees. And if you go to our website, there are links to these initiatives on there. And just a personal aside, I went to high school with Nick. So I'm very excited for this program tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nick.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Yeah, it had been such a long time since we've seen each other, and it was such a shock receiving an email from you. And I was like, oh my God, of course we have to make this happen. And it's been actually a long time coming, but I'm glad to be here tonight. Yeah, tonight we're gonna take. I hope you guys can take an opportunity to sort of sit back and relax. We're gonna have sort of a story hour where we learn all about wild bees. And these are bees that live around you guys. I grew up in Southern Connecticut, and am well familiar with the ecology of that area as well as the bees, and so happy to answer questions about what you hear tonight. About 90% of plants around the world require an animal to reproduce, and that process is known as pollination. And of those plants, about 75% of our global crops require pollination. And so in a world without pollinators, not only would we have landscapes that are far less colorful and floristically diverse, but also our dinner plates and our grocery stores would be far less colorful and diverse and nutritious. And this process of pollination, so we're all on the same page, is the process by which flowers exchange pollen. Pollen is the male sex cells, and the stigmas lead to the ovaries. And the union between pollen and stigma is the successful transfer of pollen between flowers, and that is pollination. Now, plants have this thorny problem where they can't move. And so they recruit bees to play matchmaker by advertising their floral displays and their sweet, sugary rewards of nectar with things like petals and fragrances. So flowers don't smell pretty for us. Flowers don't look pretty for us. They look and smell pretty in order to attract bees. And bees are some of our best pollinators, and we depend on them for a lot of the food that we eat. Now, many of you probably know of the honeybee. The European honeybee, which is not native to Eastern North America, is one of our best known bees. They live in big hives of 10 to 30,000 workers, headed by a single queen. And these workers are all female. And they are tasked with gathering pollen and nectar to bring back to the hive and feed the developing brood. And these bees have a penchant for hexagons. You'll see how this whole comb is tessellated with different hexagons, and some of them have little baby white grubs in them in the top left, and others have pollen and nectar stores, such as the open ones in the bottom. And there's been some concerns in recent years as to whether the honeybee population is going to be viable going into the future. And there have been artists such as this, "When we go, we're taking you with us." There have been reports from beekeepers saying that their hives are not as productive and they're not able to survive the winter months as well. And even celebrities like Angelina Jolie and Morgan Freeman have gotten behind this and saying, we're trying to save the honeybee. And this talk is about wild bees. This talk is not about bees that are raised by beekeepers. And that's because honeybees don't need saving. Honeybees are best thought of as an agricultural commodity, such as chickens or cows. And in fact, efforts to save honeybees, a domesticated animal, are akin to saving songbirds by raising backyard chickens. Now, I suspect many of you in this group are bird watchers. You're going to see short-eared owls. And so that idea of saving wild birds by raising songbirds I'm sure seems quite preposterous. And so as someone like me, who is equally obsessed with birds and bees, the idea of saving wild bees by raising a single domesticated species is also quite preposterous. And the difference is that there aren't lots of resources for learning about the incredible diversity of wild bees that occur throughout the region. Although honeybees are not faring as well over the winter, we can continually replace their colonies because we know a lot about their biology. In contrast, other wild bees, such as this remarkable diversity here on the screen, are not as well known. These bees, these native bees that I keep mentioning, they come in every size, shape, and color. So there's green bees, there are blue bees, there are red bees, there are bees that are bigger than rigatoni, there are bees that are smaller than orzo, there are bees with antennae longer than their bodies, there are bees that only visit a single kind of sumac that lives on barrier islands. There are bees that will visit the black-eyed Susans in your backyard, but not the bee balm or the hibiscus. There are bees that dig holes in the ground. There are bees that live in pre-excavated cavities above ground. And the diversity of forms and function is simply endless when you consider that most people just consider the European honeybee. One of these bees is no longer found in the Northeast, including Westchester County. The rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, used to be one of the most abundant pollinators, especially on cranberry farms in New England. And over the last 25 years, its range has retracted more than 90%. And it's now only found in the Midwest, including Chicago, where I'm currently based. But the fact is, it used to be found from Chicago all the way east to Cape Cod and south through New Jersey, and now it's simply not found in those locales anymore. And the problem is we're not quite sure why. So the rusty patch bumblebee has declined rapidly, and so have other species. So here on on this graph on the left, we have the relative abundance of species on the x-axis, and then a variety of bumblebee species on the y-axis, these different names. And what I want you to pay attention to is the color of the dot. So the red dot across these different species indicates a species that has declined significantly over the last 100 years. And you'll see there's quite a few of them. So Bombus affinis, that's in this italics with the one black arrow, is the species that's completely extinct in Eastern North America. But I also want you to notice that it's not all bad news, that there are several blue dots on this graph, and the blue dots indicate a species that has benefited and has increased in abundance over the last 100 years. So there are winners and losers. And part of the challenge that I face as a scientist is figuring out what predisposes bees to being a winner or a loser when faced with rapid land use change. And what sorts of things might we be able to do to help some of those losers become winners in the face of rapid landscape change? We know that lots of things face bees as well as other insects, things like pollution, climate change, pesticides. And the big three really are habitat loss. So the conversion of intact habitat to homes or cities. The use of pesticides, there's one group of pesticides called neonicotinoids, that are particularly bad for insects, and then climate change. In particular, the heat waves we are experiencing during the summer can spell disaster for a bee's ability to fly and locate flowers. However, I want to add a threat that I think is not being fully appreciated, which is that there's a lot that we don't know about these bees. Unlike many birds where you can go on to pick up a book at a library or go onto a database and figure out, how many eggs does this bird lay? What is the annual cycle of its nesting? What habitats does it occupy? Now, you're going to look for short-eared owls at Shawagund grassland because we know enough about their biology that we can make these predictions and know where they're going to be at a particular place and time. We simply don't have that data for bees. And so in order to save the native bees, we need to know our native bees. And over the last 6 years, 7 years as a scientist, I've spent a lot of my time conducting research to better understand these native bees and learn what they're doing throughout the entire year. And so it's great that we can watch bees in our garden or we can notice bees on flowers. But I think without the context of what bees are doing throughout the rest of their life cycle, it becomes really hard to know how our actions in gardens or how our actions at nature preserves are likely to influence their populations. I think it's important to start by saying, what is a bee? So we're going to do a little quiz to see where we're all at. Don't worry, it's not graded. There's 6 images on the screen. Some of them are bees. Some of them are not bees. I call this to be or not to be. And all I want you to do is think to yourself or to the person you're watching with, which of these letters is a bee and which of these letters is not a bee. And I'll give you about 30 seconds. Okay, great. So it turns out that only 2 of these are bees, C and F. All the other ones are imposters. A is a hoverfly, these big bulging eyes with stubby antennae. Mud dauber wasp in the middle. Note the really skinny wasp waist that bees don't have. The letter D down here, it's a tricker. This is a robber fly that mimics bumblebees, but it only has 2 wings, whereas bees always have 4. And E, although Winnie the Pooh taught us that bees live in hives that hang from trees, it turns out that bees never live in hives that hang from trees. And this is a bald-faced hornet nest. Now, hornets can be pesty, but they also control biting flies. So if you can thank them for taking the deer flies and the horse flies away from your picnic. But C and F are bees. Now you'll notice that this bee on the top right is green, so bees can be green. And this bee on the bottom is orange, but the uniting feature here is that they got pollen, orange dust all over their bodies. And that is part of my main definition for a bee, which is a bee is simply a vegetarian wasp. And to understand why this is my definition, we have to go back to a time before there were bees, and before they were really flowering plants. It's about 130 million years ago. 130 million years ago, flowering plants were a recent innovation on planet Earth. And there were insects that quickly capitalized on the novelty of flowering plants, such as pollen or sort of thick petals that they could chew and consume. Now, wasps are in a much older lineage on Earth. And these wasps are known, all wasps are known as being carnivores. So they're eating other insects. And these hunting wasps found a new source of food in the insects that visited flowers, these primitive flowers. And the wasps that hunted these thrips on the flowers, got a good meal. But some of them got an extra meal because those thrips on the flowers were also covered in pollen. Now, pollen is protein rich. And so the leading hypothesis is that the wasps that were collecting insects on flowers and those insects that were covered in pollen made the switch from having an insect exclusive diet to a pollen exclusive diet. So effectively, wasps became vegans, and the wasps that became vegans are the bees that we know. And so from a small group of about 20 thrip hunting wasps, radiated 20,000 species of bees across planet Earth over the last 130 million years. And these bees are found on every continent. As I said before, they come in every size, shape, and color you can imagine. And one of the reasons that we have such a remarkable diversity of flowering plants is due in part to the remarkable diversity of bees. It's the coevolution between bees and flowers that is so fascinating. Now, bees have been in relationship with flowers for millions of years, and so they have certain features on their bodies that underscore this relationship. And one of them is the presence of branched hairs. Now, because bees have to carry pollen and consume pollen for protein, they have to have good ways of transporting it back to their homes. And the branched hairs are one of these innovations that basically increases the surface area of a bee's body. By every hair that branches, it means that they can carry more pollen than a hair that doesn't branch. And so you'll see the hairs on the left in this microscope image. All I mean by branched hair is that the hair has little hairs that come off of it. And maybe those smaller hairs have hairs that come off of it. And so it looks feathered as opposed to a single strand. And every bee somewhere on its body has a branched hair. Beyond knowing what a bee is and what a bee isn't, I think it's important that we know what our native bees do. And I've simplified it down to doing three things. They build nests, they visit flowers, and they hibernate over the winter. Perhaps our best known wild bee is the bumblebee. Now, you'll see these guys on flowers in your gardens, on flowers on the sidewalk, and they're easily identified because they're big, chunky, fuzzy, and often come in sort of yellow and black patterns. In spring, the queen bumblebees come out from hibernation, and they refuel on spring blooming trees like this redbud. And they drink nectar, which is sugar and carbohydrates for energy, and they gather pollen, which is protein, to bring back to their nest. These queens are storing pollen on their hind legs here. Now they get to work finding
whatever you did. Let's see if it cuts off.
They get to work finding the location for a nest, which is an old rodent burrow or an old log, someplace that is nice and cozy and roomy, often underground and out of the way. They don't want to be disturbed. They have a whole growing season ahead of them. Now, this queen, which is just a single individual, lays eggs, and those eggs hatch into workers, which are her daughters, all female. And they get to work gathering more food to grow the next generation. And in summer, these workers can be seen, and they quite literally multiply in a matter of weeks. It takes about 3 weeks for a bumblebee to go from egg to adult. And so, between the months of May and July, the number of bumblebees rapidly expands on the landscape. And they visit all sorts of flowers. Some of them prefer visiting open flowers like roses or spireas. Others like more complicated flowers that have to be pried apart, like those in the pea family, such as lupin or clovers. And still others have really long tongues, and they visit flowers that hummingbirds visit with long tubes to access the nectar, like bee balm. One thing that bumblebees can do is buzz. And I actually mean this more than just make a buzzing noise. Some flowers require a particular frequency of vibration in order to release the pollen. And this behavior is known as buzz pollination. Now, not all bees can do this, and importantly, honeybees cannot, but bumblebees can. And so they can vibrate their bodies. They literally sing at the frequency that the flower requires in order to access that pollen. Some flowers require an E. Other flowers require middle C. Like if you're an audiophile, I think you might be quite interested in this. That if you take a tuning fork, you can hit it on your hand and then hold it up to a tomato flower or an eggplant flower in your vegetable garden, and you'll see a little plume of pollen come out the tip. So some of our main crops like tomatoes, eggplants, chilies, and blueberries are all buzz-pollinated plants. And so this means that we can't rely on honeybees just for pollination of those crops. We need species like bumblebees to help us out. In the fall, the colony has reached its zenith. There's dozens of workers inside, and the colony is big enough to produce new queens and males. These new queens and males will mate with each other. The queens find a nice, cozy place to spend the winter, and the males, the old colony and the old workers and the old queen, they all die. So this is an annual life cycle whereby every year is an opportunity to produce new queens that will continue the generation to next year. So this is an infographic that sort of describes the life cycle that I just explained. And one thing the two key things from this is that bumblebees need safe spots to nest, right? So they need places to nest, and they need flowers throughout the year. But not all bees live in hives. In fact, bees live on a continuum of societies. They range from the highly social honeybees to the less highly social bumblebees that only live for 1 year, all the way down to the solitary bees. And in fact, more than 70% of our bees live a solitary life cycle. I mean, they actually don't live or nest with other bees. And we're going to focus on solitary bees for the rest of the talk because not only are they near and dear to me, but they make up a good part of the diversity of bees that you'll see around. Because bees are solitary, this means that they don't live in a hive, which means there's no queen. And it also means that they don't make honey. And without a hive to protect or a queen to keep safe or honey to guard, they actually have no need to sting. And so this means although bees get a bad rep for being nasty and stinging, they actually, in most cases, most bees are quite gentle and docile. And it's actually yellow jackets, the social wasps, that are responsible. For my graduate work, I studied a group of solitary bees known as cellophane bees. And I think they are the archetypal below-ground solitary bee. So this is a lake that I visited often as a student up in Massachusetts. It's a sandy lake shore. There's red maples that are rimming the shoreline, and oaks and some birch trees. And people love picnicking here and going for swims. And you'll notice that the lakeshore is quite sandy and easily excavated. And that's prime habitat for these cellophane bees. So I would ride my bike down from my dorm to check out the sandy beach and see if I could find any bees. Now it's like mid-March and I'm really eager. And so on this day, I arrived and there were no bees to be seen. The next day was equally warm out, high 40s, low 50s, very sunny. And I said, I think I got a good shot. So I went back down again. And this adorable fluff muffin was out. This is such a cute little bee. This is the male cellophane bee. And the male cellophane bee was out zooming around over the leaves, sunning himself on brightly lit oak leaves or on benches that were warmer than the air. And you'll notice that these bees are very hairy, and the males have long antennae and are covered with a little golden mustache of hair. And this is a thing that many male bees have. They have a little tuft of hair on their face that we like calling mustaches. So the males are out and they're zooming around. And this is an example of what I mean. Here's a video. All of these little black dots that are moving around, those are all individual bees. Now I'm sitting in the middle of this neighborhood of bees. As many bees as you see in front of the camera are behind me. And you'll notice that I am not at all getting stung or being attacked. These bees are not aggressive in the slightest. Children that encounter these on playgrounds often call them tickle bees because sometimes they'll land on your leg and walk around and it feels ticklish. And I know people say that, the robin is the first bird of spring. Now, being in an Audubon club, I'm sure you also know why that's not true. But cellophane bees are the real harbingers of spring. The first couple of warm days in March, these bees are up and at it. And they're looking for females. These females are quite a bit bigger, shorter antennae, no mustache on the face. And they mate just once. And after that, the males are pushed out of the picture. Sometimes quite literally, the females will kick the males away because the males do not help around the house. And the females get to work building nests. She will excavate a long tunnel underground, and she'll sit in the entrance to sun herself to get enough energy to fly. Remember, bees are not warm-blooded, and so they have to, they're literally solar powered, and they sit in their nests to warm up, and so they can fly. And they'll pick sites to dig these nests in close proximity to one another. So although they're solitary living and every hole belongs to just one female, they're social butterflies, and they love being near each other. And so here's an example of an aggregation that I found at this park where, and all these little mounds of tan-colored sand, these are all the nests of cellophane bees. And I know they're not ant nests because the hole is about the width of a pencil rather than the width of a pin or a piece of spaghetti. So a nice big hole about the width of a bee, because she's going in and out. Now, when a bee departs the nest, how does she remember which hole is hers? There's so many of them to keep track of. She actually marks her pile of sand with a unique pheromone or an aroma. And this is how she finds her way back. So although we are very visual and we put mailboxes or we hang wreaths on our doors, bees have a heightened olfactory sense, and they can use smell far better than we can. And so they can smell their way back from the tops of the trees to their very nest. And so as you know, as the nature observer, you get curious. You're like, well, what if I put a leaf over her entrance? Or what if I move some sand around? And if you put a leaf over her entrance, she knows that her nest is under that leaf and she sneaks under. But if I move some of her sand just to the side, she gets a little confused because now the whole area smells like her home and she doesn't know precisely where that entrance is. Now, you don't want to do this too much because it really ruins their day. But it goes to show you that bees have a very simple and straightforward mechanism for finding their way home, but it's often invisible to us. When she leaves her nest, she's going up to find food. And this food is pollen and nectar. Same for bumblebees, right? And because she's active in early spring, there are not a lot of wildflowers on the ground for her to visit. So she goes up into the trees. Now, you might not know, but trees like red maples have pollen and nectar in their flowers in early spring. So the last week of March, first week of April, the red maple canopy is just absolutely on fire with these ruby flowers, and there are bees in attendance. Now, not only is this bee getting a nectar meal, but she's getting pollen on her legs. And you'll see on this particular photograph that I took, she has pollen all over her body. There's little yellow dust all up and down on her wings, on her face, on her antennae. Now, this is pollen that she's not packing into her legs. This is pollen that's going to be deposited on the next stigma that she visits. And this is pollination in action. A bee is trying to get a meal, nectar and pollen. And in doing so, she accidentally picks up some pollen and transfers it to the next flower. And so I say this because pollination, although we often ascribe intent, or we even call them pollinators, bees do not know they are pollinators. Bees know that they are bees and they are trying to make more bees. And pollination is an accident or a byproduct of this tight relationship that bees and flowers have. When she goes back underground, she goes into her nest, which can extend 1 to 2 feet below the surface, and she goes to what's known as a brood cell. Now, she's created a chamber out of her own saliva that creates a waterproof lining to the soil so that the nectar that she's gathered doesn't seep into the sand. Now, this is why they're called cellophane bees, because this natural waterproof lining is thin and translucent, akin to cellophane. And inside this brood cell, which is about the size of a jelly bean, she'll regurgitate nectar, she'll scrape pollen off of her legs, and she'll churn it together into a nutritious soup that's called bee bread. And she'll then make another trip and repeatedly gather more pollen and nectar until she's gathered sufficient provisions. She'll hang an egg from the top of the brood cell, seal it off, and that egg has everything it needs to go from an egg into an adult bee. Now, for contrast, monarch butterflies like fly from plant to plant and like lay an egg here, lay an egg there, no care whatsoever. This bee is a great mom. She has spent all night creating a waterproof nursery for her baby. She has spent, 8 or 9 hours out of maybe her only few 100-hour life gathering pollen and nectar and dodging birds and dodging rain and wind to gather the pollen and nectar for this baby bee. And then she even seals it off from underground predators. And so inside that little chamber is a baby bee. And I'm always just in awe at how much care a mama bee gives to each offspring. She can try her hardest. The mama bee can try her hardest, but there are still predators that are trying to mess with the system. This is the blister beetle. And inside the aggregation, on the sand, roaming around, are adult female beetles. Now, these beetles can't fly, and they don't even eat. but they emerge from hibernation in perfect synchrony with the bees. The female beetles mate with the males, and then the female beetles lay eggs in the sand. Those eggs hatch into larvae that smell irresistible to male cellophane bees. And the male cellophane bees go over and mess around, even sometimes try to mate with a ball of larvae. And in doing so, they become covered in parasitic larvae. Now, these larvae don't want to be on the male. They want to get inside the nest. And so when the male mates with a female, the larvae jump from one bee to the next, and now they're on the female bee. She goes down into the nest to drop off provisions, and the beetle larvae hop off inside the brood cell. And now they're exactly where they want to be. The beetles kill the host bee egg, and they develop on the provisions. And now, if you're talking about like a game of roulette here, you go from an egg laid in the sand to an egg that's found its way to a nutritious soup of pollen and nectar. It's quite the remarkable balancing act. Now, when I tell this story, it's always really tempting to malign the beetle and ascribe that the beetle is a bad or an enemy. And I don't want to say the beetle is any better or worse than the bee. The beetle is the beetle, and the bee is the bee. And the beetle is only at this aggregation because the bee population is healthy enough. And so when we think about bees and we care about protecting our native bees, it's not just about the bees, and it's not just about the flowers, but it's also about all the other interactions that these insects have with the broader ecosystem. And the blister beetle is one case of an animal that would not exist or would also be extirpated if the bees were to disappear. And so this is going to be a theme throughout the rest of the talk, where we think about bees, but also the interactions they have with other animals. By the end of May, the aggregation has subsided. All the bees are underground. And if I were to go and have a picnic in June, I would be eating my sandwich, and 2 feet below my feet would be bees munching on their little soup of pollen and nectar. And the more you know about this, it's just just because bees aren't out and flying doesn't mean they're not alive and present at a site. And so when we think about our gardens and things like that, the solitary bee might be in the nest, but it can't be out of mind. Sometimes I just gush about the cellophane bees because they're so fun and they're so cute. And I'll provide some tips on where you can go find them this spring. Other bees don't live below ground. Other bees live above ground, either in pre-excavated cavities, or they make their own cavities by excavating pith out of a woody plant stem, or they even cement together little pebbles with tree sap. We're going to talk about the renters and the excavators today. The architects are a smaller group that isn't so well represented in New England. 2 of our renter bees are the mason bees and the leafcutter bees. And they have a very different shape than our cellophane bees. They're a bit more rotund and pill-shaped. And they always have this nice scruff of hair under their abdomens. So unlike the cellophane bees that carry pollen on their legs, or the bumblebees, these mason bees and leafcutter bees carry pollen underneath their abdomens, their bums. And true to their name, they make their nests out of different materials. So our cellophane bees made their nests out of that natural waterproof lining. Leafcutter bees will line their nests with leaves. Mud bees or mason bees will line their nests with mud. And there are even resin bees that will build their nests in a cavity and line their nests with tree sap. And so you can see here how these bees construct a line. Their nest is linear, going from the back to the front. Each of these chambers contains a pollen mass, pollen bread, and a bee that is developing or has already spun a cocoon on and is developed. So this underscores another feature of the bee life cycle. Just like butterflies that go from egg to larva to chrysalis to adult, bees also progress through a similar sequence of stages from egg to larva to cocoon or pupa to adult. This also means that once you've metamorphosed into an adult, you don't change size. So tiny bees are forever tiny, and big bees are forever big. They do all of their growing as the larval stage and all of their foraging and mating as the adult stage. When you're out exploring, sometimes you'll see clues that leafcutter bees have been in the area. I was walking to my advisor's house during grad school one summer, and I noted a redbud leaf. They look like spades. And I noted a redbud leaf with these discs cut out from the edge. Now, the rest of the leaf, it wasn't cut up like Swiss cheese. It was just the margins of the leaf. And the fact that the holes were only on the margins meant to me that a leafcutter bee had been in the area. The bee had come, grabbed the leaf with her forelegs, and then sliced away a little disc with her mandibles and carried it back to her nest. And so in addition to making repeated trips for pollen and nectar, these bees have to make repeated trips to gather wallpaper to line the insides of their nests. Now, many of you might have come across the idea of a bee hotel. These bee hotels are basically walls of cavities designed to attract these leafcutter bees and these mason bees. They're not attractive to ground nesting bees like cellophane bees. I might get into it at the end. If I don't have time for it, please ask at the end if you're curious. I do have some reservations about sort of recommending that everybody installs these bee hotels. In order for these to be good for bees, you have to be a good hotel manager. And that means being a conscientious and responsible attendant and making sure those domiciles are clean for the bees from year to year. And I have some tips if you're interested. I told you there was going to be a theme. These cavities also have their own suite of threats. There are wasps that try to sneak their eggs into the nests of these leafcutter bees and these mason bees. However, there's a different strategy that needs to be employed. Rather than relying on placing eggs in the sand and relying on this incredibly convoluted mechanism where the male bee mates with the female bee and the larvae hop over, these wasps take matter into their own hands. And they smell their way to an open cavity on a bee hotel or on a tree. And they smell and they wait for a female, the host bee, to leave. With mama bee out of the house, the wasp grabs the entrance and begins to extend its ovipositor, which is along an egg-laying organ. Now, all bees have ovipositors and all wasps have ovipositors. But if you're a parasitic wasp and you need to make sure that you can get an egg into any of those brood cells, that ovipositor needs to be extra long. So much so that it looks a little goofy. So here is a video with a wasp on the far right side of a linear cavity. And you can see this line is the ovipositor. That's maybe 3 to 4 times the length of this wasp's body. Now here's the ovipositor. And this female wasp is trying to lay an egg in this middle cell. Now the tip just looks like a needle. Nothing, nothing. And then there's an egg, just like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. What? Like, it's the most remarkable thing. This wasp has found her way to a cavity. Not only has she found her way to a cavity that does not have a bee in it, but she's also managed to bypass the brood cell that is being actively constructed. Because if she lays an egg here, the female bee is going to come back. If she lays an egg in the far right cell, the female bee is going to come back and notice that there's an egg that she didn't lay there. So the wasp is very sneaky about this and lays an egg in the middle cell that's already been completed and cannot be checked on by the host bee. So from this nest, some brood cells will be bees, others will be wasps. And again, not going to malign the wasp, but it's an important part of the ecosystem, and these interactions between bees and wasps I find to be endlessly fascinating. You know, how many of you like watching the nature documentary where you're going and seeing the gazelle evade the lion? This is a safari just shrunk down on micro scale and is happening right in your backyard. So the other kind of cavity nesting bees are these excavators. And very briefly, we have 2 flavors of carpenter bees. And all a carpenter bee is a bee that excavates pithy or woody material. So many of you might be familiar with our large carpenter bees because they love eating wood out of the deck. But there's also many kinds of small carpenter bees that you might not have noticed that are small and blue, and they like excavating pith out of raspberry canes and elderberry stems. So our small carpenter bees are very cute and shiny blue, and you'll see lots of them on goldenrods in the fall months. They sort of look wasp-like, but remember, they're going to have bright yellow pollen on their legs. Meanwhile, the carpenter bees that eat your deck are a bit more conspicuous. And although I never advocate for killing bees, sometimes they compromise the integrity of your backyard, your home, or your deck. And so one thing you can do is to sort of discourage them from living there. You can paint over the wood, or you can plug it with steel wool or caulk over the entrance. Sometimes you may need to do a targeted pesticide treatment. I never advocate for sort of broad scale insecticides or sort of willy-nilly applying it. But again, like, don't compromise your safety or the safety of your family because you have a gallery of carpenter bees in the side of your deck. So the next thing that bees do, and I've alluded to this throughout the talk, is that they visit flowers. But I want to highlight at least one story about how bees visit flowers. So we've been over this. Bees are vegetarians, vegans, right? They eat flowers. They eat nectar, which is carbohydrates, and pollen, which is protein. And making sure that your landscape provides food for bees requires thinking about both nectar and pollen.
What are you doing?
But the flowers that bees visit is not random. Bees are physically constrained by the length of their tongue and their size to visit certain flowers. So big bumblebees have relatively long tongues, and they often are found on big, deep flowers like Monarda, this bee balm, or salvia, or sometimes, flowers that hummingbirds might visit, like cardinal flower or lobelia. Whereas smaller bees, like this masked bee here, they have really, really short tongues, and you often don't see them far from things like goldenrod or Queen Anne's lace that are sort of flat dinner plates where you just sort of walk over and the nectar is there for drinking. So sort of thinking about what do flowers look like can help you predict what bees are going to visit it. Still, some pollinators like to break the rules a little bit. And these carpenter bees are particularly fond of breaking the rules. They will actually cut little holes in the base of these flowers. And this is called nectar robbing. So rather than try to force their tongue through the entrance as the flower intended, they cut a hole in the base and they sip nectar out of the nectaries and bypass the whole pollination system. And once that carpenter bee's cut a hole, all these other tiny bees will be able to access the nectar as well. So another thing you can look for in your garden are little wounds on the base of long tubular flowers. And you'll see bees, instead of going through the entrance of the flower, will be sort of crawling along the petals or the tube and accessing the holes. I've seen this done on hostas, clearly this image of a salvia, or things like blueberry or andromeda or pyrus flowers. So protein is very pollen rich, and bees take a lot of measures to making sure that pollen they gather on flowers it travels well. So on this bee here, she actually hasn't collected any pollen yet, but on her hind leg, you'll see that she has a big brush of hairs, like a bottle brush that you would use to clean something out. And these are the branched hairs I'm talking about. On this bee in particular, this is a sunflower bee. She has extra branched hairs. Not only are her hairs branched, but on her legs, the hairs branches have branches and the branches have branches. Like, it is just a supernova of branched hairs on her legs. And this is because she has lots of pollen to gather. And she can do a variety of behaviors or dances to gather this pollen. We've talked about the bumblebees who buzz, but there are the longhorn bees that scrabble. There are the little fairy bees that scrape. There are the mason bees that tap. And as you start to watch bees on flowers and things like that, you'll notice that they have a variety of behaviors. And sometimes these behaviors are quite informative for figuring out what bee you have. Regardless of the mechanism they use to gather pollen, they store it safely for travel on their body. We learned that our leafcutter bees and our mason bees, they carry it dry under their bellies. or on their butts. We learned that many solitary bees carry it dry on their legs, such as this green sweat bee or our cellophane bee. And we also learned that things like bumblebees and honeybees carry the pollen in pellets on their leg. Now, bumblebees and honeybees are extra efficient at carrying pollen because they mix the pollen with a little bit of nectar. And this means that even if they get jostled during flight or on a flower, that pollen is not getting knocked off. And so the pollen they gather is the pollen they return with. In addition to gathering pollen, some bees are very restricted in the types of pollen they gather, and they will only gather pollen from one or a few kinds of flowers. I mentioned the sunflower bee. There are blueberry bees that only visit flowers from blueberry, and this bee in particular has an extra long face. She has evolved to have, her species has evolved to have extra long faces for accessing the pollen and nectar deep inside these white chalices. And then there's bees in the fall that visit exclusively goldenrods and asters for pollen. About 30% of our bees are picky eaters in this way. One of my favorite bees you can find in the vegetable garden. You get up early in the morning, 6, 7 o'clock, and you go out to your squash and zucchini plants. And the early bee gets the flower. The squash bee is one of our most important producers and pollinators of squash. And that's because they're a specialist of squash. Their sole source of pollen is the squash plant. Now, in the garden, their entire life revolves around squash. The males and the females mate. Remember, the males get out of the picture, and the female digs a hole underground near the squash plant. There's all these little mounds of dirt by these squash plants, and these are all homes of solitary squash bees. The squash bee females gather pollen until they can't gather pollen anymore, which is about noon. If you're a squash grower, you'll know that squash flowers open early and they close in the heat of the day. And so the female bee retires to her nest because that's the safest place for her. But the male bees have nowhere else to be. They're not welcome in the nest. And so rather than sit exposed on a leaf, they take a siesta inside the flowers. So this is the best activity you can do with kids. You just go out to the garden and you peel open a squash flower at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And inside that starburst, you're going to see 2 or 3 male bees all huddled up next to each other. Now, this is a very safe activity because in the bee world, males cannot sting. They literally don't possess a stinger. And so you don't have to worry about a bee being startled. And remember, the females don't sleep in the flowers because they have a nest. So go out and check your garden this summer for squash bees. They're almost certainly there. It wouldn't be a story about a bee without a story about something that depends on the bee. And this is a cuckoo bee. This is literally a bee whose entire life revolves around another bee. When mama squash bee is out of the nest gathering squash pollen, the squash cuckoo bee takes her chance. She finds the nest by smelling her way to the entrance and slips inside. She crawls through the dark tunnels, minute after minute, looking for an open brood cell, and she lays an egg inside. Now, in order so the squash bee doesn't detect, she will lay sometimes their eggs are very tiny. Other times they'll lay their eggs inside the wall of the brood cell. They conceal their egg so that it doesn't get rejected. Inside so then the squash bee, having found a brood cell, laid an egg, she crawls on her way out and she carries on her way. Mama squash bee comes back, no idea what's just transpired, finishes sealing up the brood cell, carries on her way, and inside she's locked in a killer. The cuckoo bee larva hatches with huge, enormous mandibles, and those jaws slice the squash bee egg in half. And the cuckoo bee larva develops on the pollen provisions into an adult squash bee. It would never eat the bee. Remember, bees are vegans. You don't have to be a carnivore to be an assassin. And so the squash bee larva eats the pollen and nectar, becomes a squash bee, and next year that garden will have squash bees and cuckoo bees. And for the last time, I'm going to encourage you to to think not about maligning the squash bee, the cuckoo bee. It has its own series of threats to contend with, such as this crab spider. This is a camouflaged crab spider that doesn't spin a web, but sits in wait on ambushes, insects that land on flowers. And this crab spider got a lucky meal of a cuckoo bee. And so this is what it's all about. The simple act of planting squash in your garden, because maybe you like making ratatouille or you like having a butternut squash soup. The simple act of planting squash means that you're supporting squash bees, which means you're supporting cuckoo bees, which means you're supporting crab spiders, which means you're supporting mockingbirds that eat those crab spiders. And you're supporting mites that live on crab spiders, and so on and so forth. And so it really means that the simple act of planting a garden really can make a difference and towards supporting this sort of wondrous, intricate, impossibly complex web of biodiversity in our backyards. My tips for how you can make a difference, I say, follow the mnemonic SEEDS, S-E-E-D-S. S stands for spread native flowers. You can plant a pollinator garden. It can be any size, whether it's a small garden in a pot on a balcony or a patch in your front yard, or a strip along the sidewalk, or you come together with neighbors to plant a sidewalk median. Any area that's intentionally designed and planted with the needs of insect pollinators in mind counts as a pollinator garden. The one key thing about a pollinator garden is that you should have blooms that extend across the entire season. So in spring, that means flowers that bloom on trees, maple trees, and tulip trees, and cherry trees. In this case, our gardens at the university where I was at in Boston, they had these hawthorn trees that came into bloom in May. We had some irises in the garden. And we had foxglove beardtongue, a penstemon, and we had this spirea that it was not native, but the facilities loved planting it, and there were several bees in the city that were quite fond of the spirea. Then in July, the shrubs and the trees have finished blooming, and we have things like Culver's root and sunflowers and bee balm starting to flower. In August, our garden was just absolutely popping with insects and ironweed and compass plant, rudbeckias and goldenrods. It's just, it's overwhelming for the senses, 40, 50 species of insects in an area the size of a card table. In September, the insect diversity is sort of fading, as so is our flower diversity, but we've managed to provide resources every week of the year so far. In this case, we have New England asters and goldenrods. And in October, November, our garden is still part of the landscape because the seeds that the bees produced via pollination become food for migrating sparrows on their way south. And it's stunning what you find in this garden. I've had palm warblers eating seeds that bees pollinated off of goldenrods. I've had chipping sparrows that should not have been here in early November. They were eating seeds out of our gardens, and they were only eating the seeds because bees pollinated them. So quite a remarkable legacy these bees leave, which is food for other animals. In winter, just as now, is the time for contemplation and reflection and thinking about the garden you want to plant this year. Here are some sources of native plants and information that I quite like. I'm not as familiar with native plant nurseries in Westchester area. I imagine many of you may know, and it seems like your seed swap, your seed sale might be that a great source as well. But yeah, if you have questions, happy to answer them after them. It wouldn't be a talk about bees and gardens without my recommendations. I've picked these plants. You feel free to screenshot this. It's also recorded, right? So there's season-long blooms. So I've tried to pick flowers for my recommendations that go from May all the way through frost in the Northeast, and they hit on a variety of diversity. So we have open flowers that look like that look like dinner plates. We have flowers that look like bells, flowers that look like trumpets. We have sunflowers. We have flowers with short corollas and flowers with deep corollas. And importantly, the flowers on this list also support specialist bees, those picky eaters. Lance leaf coreopsis supports half dozen aster specialists. Early sunflower supports an equal number of sunflower specialists, but later in the year. 10 to 12 species of bees are specialists on asters and goldenrods in the area. Some of our most threatened bumblebees are their favorite flower in the garden is wild bergamot. And so this list was not just because I think they're pretty, which I think they are, but it's also rooted in ecology of our native bees. There's bonus. What if you don't have a sunny yard? What if you only have a shade yard? There are plants for you to grow for bees too. Spring wildflowers like spring beauty and trout lily, as well as wild geranium, golden alexanders, shrubby dogwoods like red twig dogwood. And then there's asters and goldenrods that are shade tolerant and are great choices for the fall garden. There's still more. We've got trees and shrubs. What if you want to plant a tree, but you don't want to plant a garden? Your tree can benefit bees. One of my absolute favorite trees for bees is the tulip tree, which just loves Westchester County. You go to like Rockefeller Preserve, and it's just absolutely, the canopy of tulip trees there is just like absolutely buzzing with bees. But if you want something a bit lower down, eastern redbud, things like highbush blueberry or black cherry or spirea are great for bees. When you're picking plants at a nursery, there's a couple of things that sort of make plants de facto bad for bees. And the first is that humans have bred them to have what's known as doubled flowers. And these are plants that maybe look fun and exciting to people, but actually have been bred to not have pollen and nectar. There are pollenless varieties of sunflowers that are grown for the horticulture industry so the pollen doesn't shed on your table when you have cut sunflowers. Unfortunately, that also means that there's no food for bees. And so knowing what you're planting and trying to avoid plants that have been too overly manipulated by people is good. You can identify cultivars by the single quotes. So sunflower without any quotes is just your wild type, but sunflower teddy bear is one of those cultivars. They're really fun to look at, but bees are not interested in them at all. And then the other thing is be very skeptical of great for pollinators advertising. This is a seed mix that is commonly sold at Home Depot and big box stores, and it contains a variety of flowers, most of which are actually not native to North America, and actually are quite terrible for pollinators. And so there's a lot of greenwashing, or call it bee washing, behind some of this advertising. And so be very skeptical of things like this. The E in seeds, so it's S for spread native flowers. E is employ a life cycle approach, which just means consider the flowers, the nesting, and the hibernation, the three things that we went over today. In the interest of time, and I will get into this, but in the interest of time, I will talk about two things. One of the easiest things you can do is just don't clean up your garden as much. So one of the things you can just don't clean up. And there's this new movement called leave the leaves. And so you can leave patches of leaves in your yard. And I recommend that you rake them off of your yard. If you leave leaves on your grass, it's going to lead to killing the grass. So I recommend raking them to the side, leaving them in a pile, or leaving a 1 to 2 inch layer of leaves in the sort of the beds of your yard or the margins of your yard where you might want to grow a garden, but not in the middle of the grass. It's going to lead it to be very unsightly. And raking the leaves is totally fine. What you don't want to do is chop up the leaves. Like, don't run a lawnmower or don't run them through a shredder. The whole idea behind leaving leaves is that you're preserving the insects that either are living inside of the leaves or need intact leaf cover to survive the winter. And shredding them basically shreds the insects as well. Some of the insects that live in leaves are bumblebee queens when they find a nice place to hibernate, and butterflies like mourning cloaks that are adults during winters. The second E in seeds is eliminate pesticides. It's really quite simple. What kills a mosquito, or what's advertised as killing mosquitoes, kills the bee. And I think if you have a yard, just don't spray insecticides. And if you don't have a yard, you can still participate by going and voting for pesticide restrictions. The D in seeds is discover what's around you. And this is the best part. This is my favorite part of this whole thing, is going out and just watching bees on flowers. The idea is that, me, myself included, I was scared of bees for like 20 years. And I ran at the sight of a bee, or running at the sight, hearing a buzz. And it took time to pay attention and notice bees. And over that time, I developed a relationship with them, and a closer relationship. And so I began to care for them. Rather than being the sort of thing that I feared, kept it at a distance, I brought bees into my life, and they became a lot closer. And I think my journey is quite summed up by this Mary Oliver quote, which is, attention is the beginning of devotion. If you want to care about something, the first thing you have to do is pay attention to it. So you can go bee watching. All of you are going bird watching for short-eared owls. Well, when the flowers come out, you can take your binoculars and go bee watching. I wrote a field guide with my colleague, Max McCarthy, who's a student at Rutgers, called Bees of the Northeast. And it's a field guide with arrows pointing at the identification features that you can see on flowers. No pin specimens, no microscopes. If you have a camera or binoculars, you can learn to identify bees in your garden. And we cover 55 species of common bees in the Northeast, including your region. If you're looking for a new pair of binoculars or something a little bit lighter, highly recommend Papilio Pentax binoculars. These are amazing close focus binoculars. You can stand and focus on your feet, and they're great for watching insects. I've talked about some of these bees today, our cellophane bees, our green bees, our bumblebees. All of these are really common, and you can find them. In fact, right before this talk, I did a quick search on iNaturalist for bees where cellophane bees have been cited. So somebody last April, or a couple Aprils ago, found an unequal cellophane bee gathering pollen outside of a nest at the Edith G. Reed Wildlife Sanctuary right by Playland. And so this April, you can go and see cellophane bees nesting in aggregation, males zooming above the ground. And it's all made possible because someone went out and discovered the bees around them. And so if you do this, I encourage you to contribute to iNaturalist. It's an amazing resource. I use it all the time. And I'm on there constantly verifying identifications. And you can tag me. I'm Bee Searcher. And you can tag me in your observations. If you're really into this, and this talk has like totally changed your life, which maybe it did, I hoped it did, you can sign up for the course that Max and I teach every summer at Eagle Hill Institute in Maine. We've had participants come from all over, including New York City, to Eagle Hill, which is up near Acadia. And it's a week-long course where we'll teach you how to notice and identify bees on flowers in just a beautiful and secluded slice of land. If you're curious, I'm happy to answer questions about it or provide you more information online. And then the last S of seeds is share with others. Like, don't keep your observations to yourself. Share them with others. Like, if you love bees and you love insects and you love your garden, share it with other people and talk about how much you've learned and how exciting it is. You got to get everybody on this bandwagon. And to save bees, it takes a hive. So thanks for bearing with me. I just have one more minute of things to say. And so over this whole thing, right, so what is the main takeaway from the talk? And the idea is that if you ever forget seeds, you forget what to do for our native bees, you could email me, you could look online, but you could also just go out and watch bees, and the bees will tell you everything they need to know. You focus on a patch of flowers, you sort of slow your breath, and you just watch as they fly from flower to flower. And you'll notice that they have particular behaviors or particular preferences, that some of them are fuzzy and some of them are slender. And maybe you do this over and over again, 3, 4, 5 days a month. And you start getting into a practice of watching bees. And you'll learn that they don't require much. You'll learn that these bees require simply small, intentional, and repeatable actions. Things like planting their favorite flowers throughout the year because you notice which flowers they prefer in the garden. Or things like telling the pesticide company we're not interested because the bees bring joy and delight and wonder into my life, and I don't want to have them leave. I actually like them and welcome them into my yard. Or teaching a child that bees should be revered and not feared, because look how close you can get to a bee and not worry about it. Look, you can stand at a nesting aggregation and not worry. Or you can watch a butterfly land on you and not worry. Which means at the end of the day, each and every one of us has the agency and the ability to keep our backyards, but also our forests full of bees like Andrena erigeneae, and our old fields full of bees like Bombus fervidus, and our pine barrens full of bees like Calides validus, and our meadows full of Andrena nubecula, and our headlands full of Habropoda laboriosa, our wetlands full of Duphoria noviangliae, our dunes full of Calides speculiferus, and our gardens full of bumblebees and cellophane bees and Agapas inverescens, each of which can help us spark wonder and cultivate empathy for non-humans and help us grow a more livable future. Thank you so much for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
Let's see what they are.
That was outstanding. Thank you so much, Nick. Very informative. There were so many things I was like, whoa. One of the things that blew my mind was about like the buzzing, and then the different frequencies with the notes. I never even thought of that before. So really great presentation. Thank you so much. And we do have quite a few questions in the chat. The first one is from Carol. What is the difference between a miner bee and a cellophane bee? I'm not sure what I'm seeing in my yard.
That's a great question, Carol. I didn't go over miner bees, and they're actually like common names of bee are kind of a mess. Like birds, they got their act together. Bees, it's kind of complicated. Mining bees refer to a group of bees called Andrena that also dig holes underground. One of the main differences is if you get a photograph or through binoculars, the face of cellophane bees, the eyes are angled downwards towards each other, and the mining bees have eyes that are parallel up and down. But ecologically, they're both active in spring. They both often live in aggregations. And if you take a photograph and email it to me, or you describe, is it orange, is it tan colored, depending on what time of year you see it, we can narrow down the possibilities. There's about 110 species of mining bee in like Eastern North America.
Great. And she had also asked, how can we support cellophane bees in our yards? What type of plants do they need?
So to support cellophane bees, as I mentioned, any sort of spring blooming shrub or tree. So the cellophane bees I talked about are quite generalized. They love red maple. They love redbud. They love cherry or apple trees. One of the reasons they're somewhat of a common bee is they have such broad preferences. They're not one of our picky bees. And there are other cellophane bees that come out in late May and early June that love tulip trees. So if you have a tulip tree, it blooms later in the spring, early summer. Those cellophane bees are going to love the tulip tree.
Great. And Alice had asked, and I believe that you do have a slide that you mentioned this. Any suggestions for native plants for shade gardens? Which I believe you do have a slide.
I did.
Yes.
I'm happy to go back. Yeah, here's my slide for shade gardens.
Great. And Wendy said, Nick, you're a terrific lecturer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Arabella said, Westchester is fond of leaf blowing. Can you talk about the effects of leaf blowing on bees? Thank you for a fantastic presentation.
Yeah, so blowing leaves is like just kind of a disaster on many fronts, right? Not only does it like remove biomass from where it's produced, right? So like we're stripping the land of all of that productivity. It also contributes like incredible noise pollution and diesel exhaust. Like it's just the blowers we use. It's such a nuisance. bees are one of those groups where blowing leaves is actually not the worst thing for bees, right? In the sense that many of our solitary bees are safely below ground, 10 to 12 inches. And other bees are sort of in stems or in hollow logs. So we're not directly destroying bee nests. But think of the insulating properties that leaves have, right? So we're now making the ground fluctuate in temperature a lot more. And if we're not just blowing leaves, but removing stems and twigs from our yard, that can also remove valuable habitat. So I am all for making the Leave the Leaves movement compatible with our landscapes, right? So like, I'm not suggesting we should blow all the leaves away, but I'm also not saying all of our yards should be carpeted in leaves. Like, I don't also think that's practical. And so I think the solution of like raking leaves to the side, reducing our use of diesel blowers, and creating, mulching our gardens with 1 to 2 inches of leaves is a really nice compromise for keeping a tidy appearance, but also providing sustenance for our wildlife. And by all means, if you want to leave your yard carpeted in leaves and have it turn into a forest floor, like, I'm your number one fan. I just don't usually lead with that advice.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. Thank you. And Alice had asked, how do you care for a bee hotel?
Hey, I'm so glad you asked. Okay. Okay. Bee hotels are fun, but a responsibility. So here's an example bee hotel. There's a roof. There's a tin can with some bamboo rods. There's some wooden blocks with paper straws. And in order to be a good bee hotel steward, you need to make sure that, one, the hotel is facing sort of where it not too humid. Humidity is a bee's worst nightmare, hence why they like line it with this waterproof brood cell. And so you don't want it to be in the deep shade. Sort of on the edge of a forest or facing the sun is great. Morning exposure is great for a bee. The second thing is you want to make sure you have a diversity of cavity sizes. Tiny bees need small cavities that are maybe only 4 to 5 inches deep. Bigger bees, like our mason bees and our leafcutter bees, they need wider cavities, about a third of an inch wide. I'm sorry, a third of an inch or a little less. That is maybe 6 to 8 inches wide. But the most important thing about maintaining a bee hotel is that you replace the tubes annually. These bees are living and pooping inside of these tubes. And when they emerge, they leave behind all that refuse. And that refuse is contaminated with potentially disease, or there's pathogen buildup, or there are mites left behind. And the last thing you want is to own a hotel where a fresh bee is moving in to that dirty room. Yeah. And so making sure that the tubes are replaced on an annual cycle is key to making sure that your hotel is a source of bees and not a sink for bees where they don't ever leave. Now, it's a little tricky because the annual timing of the bees, right? Like, they're going to emerge from their nests when the next generation of bees is ready to move in. And so my advice is to have 2 sets of tubes that are nesting in 1 year, and maybe you remove them in spring and place them in a Tupperware box where the bees can emerge from, and you add in fresh tubes in April so that the hotel is clean and ready for whatever bees want to move in. Now, it sounds very complicated, but studies have shown that if you don't take precautions like this, not only do our bee hotels might not support all the bees we want, especially if we don't have a diversity of cavities. And if we allow them to have pathogen buildup, they can actually be bad for bee populations. And so you'll see in the news things like all buildings in Britain have to have cavities in the bricks. And it's like, well, that's great on paper, but who's cleaning those cavities? And like, what happens when the cavity is 50 feet up? You can't clean it. And so it's these sort of blanket measures that are cast as being good for bees without understanding bee biology. One thing that I think an alternative to having a structure like this is to leave stems in your garden. So before there were people making bee hotels, bees had places to live. And sometimes they'll find places to live, like in cut stems or broken stems in the wild. And so things like goldenrods or Joe Pye weed or Monarda have hollow stems. And those hollow stems are the perfect cavity for a bee. And so I recommend that if you want to try your hand at supporting stem nesting bees, you cut plants in your garden to 8 to 12 inches in height, and the bees will build nests in those stems over time. And the best way to be a good bee hotel manager in this style is just leave your garden be. Cut the stems and just let it be. And the bees will come out in a couple of years.
I love
Did that
that.
answer your question?
Yeah, let it be. When
There
in
is
doubt, let it be.
let it be. Let it be. Exactly, Erin. There's a
Yeah.
blog post that I wrote. It's called The Right Way to Leave Stems for Bees. So if you want a walkthrough, the right way to leave stems for bees, it's the first Google hit. So
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And Carol had just shared recent research is showing that some plants are now self-pollinating due to the decrease in pollinating bees. More fun to have the bees do the work. And Wendy said, I call it bee TV. And you just shared how to clean a bee hotel. Carol saying this absolutely wonderful. Loved this. Bees are the best. Thank you, Nick. A lot of people saying thank you. Fabulous presentation. Alex said, what is the range of a native bee? Do they stay in a localized area or travel far?
it's a great question, Alex. And I didn't talk about this, but explicitly, but you clearly picked up on it, right? Is that unlike a butterfly that bounces across the landscape and doesn't have a fixed home, bees have a home base. Their nest is in the ground and it doesn't move. And they make trips out from that nest to flowers. Now, the home range of a bee depends on the species. Bumblebees have home ranges more than a mile, and a forager can be found over a mile. And if they have a barrier like a body of water, sometimes they can make their way over. And so, a mile or more. Smaller bees, solitary bees, often have much smaller home ranges on the order of maybe half a kilometer or less. So like a quarter mile or less. So they're not moving very far, which means that the more gardens in a neighborhood, the less far a bee has to fly to find its next meal. So I like thinking about the actions we can take at the garden scale are very important, but they are magnified and amplified in impact when we think about the bee's eye view, about how does our garden fit within the network or the quilt of landscapes. One thing I've noticed in my mom's backyard in Connecticut is that over time, the number of bumblebees has declined, even though the amount of native gardening she done has increased. And although it's only one set of observations, it does underscore that the neighborhood in which she lives has changed for the worse. A lot of trees have come down. A big patch of forest where there used to be bumblebee nests, I'm sure, has been converted to lawn. And so it underscores that if you can get your neighbors involved in this, your yard will be better for bees as well.
Absolutely.
I got distracted. Did I even answer the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Oh,
Carol
yes, the
said,
range of a bee. Yes.
So the range of the bee.
Yes.
And Carol said fabulous photographs. And Patrick had asked, is it true that honeybees are bad for native bees, like they're competition?
In general, I think, yeah, right. So you have a honeybee, there's like 30 to 50,000 workers. Almost certainly they are extracting more resources than that environment can support, especially if we're dealing with sort of resource poor landscapes. I hesitate to have a more definitive answer because it's really hard as scientists to measure competition. At what level are we measuring competition? Yes, native bees and honeybees will use the same plants. Something like a squash bee is behaviorally adapted to wake up before the honeybees do. And so the squash bee gets to the squash plants before the honeybees are even out of the hive. And so there's a case where, although they might visit the same flowers, squash bees might not be in competition with honeybees directly. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that honeybees have lots of diseases because they're domesticated animals. And disease transfer not only occurs from honeybee colony to honeybee colony, but research has shown that it can transfer between bee species and that bumblebees can harbor honeybee viruses. And what's the best place to exchange is a flower.
Yeah.
And so these flowers can be sort of hotspots for disease transmission. And so one way of reducing the impact of a hotspot is just plant more flowers. And if your bees have more options, then they're less concentrated in a particular garden.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that as someone who has done, honeybee beekeeping. So thank you, Nick.
And I think it's important to say, I never want to minimize the joy or delight that someone gets from raising bees. Like it is such a treat, and like it is something that you're growing and you can get honey from it. And like, man, honey is so delicious. But I just don't want to confuse beekeeping with environmental stewardship. And I think if you want to keep honeybees or backyard chickens, like that's amazing. But that there are other actions we can take to help the environment.
Absolutely. And again, Alan said, wonderful presentation. Madeline shared, outstanding presentation. Wish we could do more to discourage so many residents from using pesticides regularly on their lawns and foundation plantings. It's very true. And Leslie said, this will forever expand the way I look at bees. Thanks so much. And Jane said, fantastic. My brain is buzzing. Arlene said, this is a fabulous talk with long-lasting information. Thank you so much. Excellent. Andrew, excellent talk. Very illuminating. Thanks so much. And then lastly, Mark said, bees get a bad rap, much less so for me after this wonderful talk. Thanks. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any other questions, but
I will pitch. I love giving talks. I hope you can see that. But like there are other talks. If like in 3, 4, 5 years down the line, you want like another dose of bees, we can go on a virtual safari. We can talk about how to plant gardens for pollinators, like more with designs and things like that. We can talk all about bumblebee ID. So just to consider, if you are interested in this sort of stuff, I offer things other than Secret Lives of Bees. And I promise you, it will be just more stories. Like it's just story time after story time. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you all for joining tonight. This is recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. So I know I'll be watching this again. It was absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much.
And I just want to add too, it was fantastic.
Oh, I'm so glad.
I felt like I was at the opera swooning through some aria. It was so wonderful. Thank you
my God,
so
Sandy.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting. Thank you.
Of course. My pleasure.
All right. We're going to end it now. Okay. Yep. We're ready to over and out. Thanks everybody for attending. We had a great attendance and thank you so much. And good night, everybody.
Good night. Take care. Thank you, Nick.